prices of goods and services, of course, has gone up, but so has the average tips that customers are expected to pay. Some call it tipflation, and wary consumers say they're reaching their tipping point. Isabella Diaz has more.
Tipping in the U.S. has usually been a practice reserved mostly for waiters and waitresses, bartenders and beauticians. But in recent years, it seems more businesses and service providers expect a tip upon transaction. According to Pew Research, 72% of U.S. adults say tipping is expected in more places than it was just 5 years ago.
That's cool. It's great.
Except most U.S. consumers say it's not. Whether it's adding an extra 10% for an Uber driver or tacking on an additional $5 for a food delivery courier, most say they've had enough. A summer survey by Bankrate found 66% of U.S. adults had a negative view of tipping, with 1 in 3 saying tipping culture has gotten out of control. Just last month, online food delivery platform DoorDash sparked controversy when its app warned customers if they skip the tip, drivers may skip their order. And then there's service charges. Restaurants have been including them for a while, but those service charges have grown since the COVID-19 pandemic. With COVID cases declining, businesses have kept the charges. Some even added more. And while restaurants vary on what exactly those service charges go toward, there's a consensus among U.S. consumers that those extra charges have to go. Economists say one reason for tip fatigue is cashless payment apps.
Start taking payments your way with Square.
According to data from credit card processor Square, nearly 75% of remote transactions for food and beverage now prompt the customer to leave a tip. Why the big push? One financial services industry expert says it's because app makers get a cut of the total, incentivizing them to add the tipping option.
Your customer can select a tip if she likes and sign.
Even when users do decide to tip, how much is too much versus just the right amount? According to Statista, a third of Americans say the sweet spot is somewhere between 16 and 20%. Isabella Diaz, CGTN.
Just fascinating stuff. For more insight into this tipping culture, some call it's in the U.S., we're going to bring in Michael Lynn, Professor of Consumer Behavior and Marketing at Cornell University's School of Hotel Administration. Welcome to the show. I have so many questions. Let me start with this. Some say these businesses should just pay their employees more and do away with this sort of expected tipping that all of us have now, I guess, been accustomed to.
Sure, that's an option. The problem is that in order to pay their employees more, they're going to have to raise menu prices. People have this mistaken view that because tips reduce labor costs, that it's a bonanza for the business. But that's just not true. Almost certainly, those labor savings get passed on to consumers in the form of lower prices. And so tipping doesn't subsidize the business. What it does is it lets wealthy and generous consumers subsidize the patronage of less wealthy, less generous consumers.
Right, but one could also argue that regular customers who are not wealthy, who partake in ordering takeout, whether it's Uber Eats or wherever you go, that those tips make the actual product or service more expensive, and ultimately that is an inflation element for regular folks.
Consumers, you're absolutely right that when I'm expected to tip, that's an additional cost that I should logically add into the primary legally mandated payment. But we know that consumers don't do that. They tend to ignore tips when they evaluate the expensiveness of businesses. And so one problem businesses have, if they were to eliminate tipping and increase their menu prices 20%, the actual end of experience cost is the same across those two settings, but consumers are going to think that they're more expensive in the option without tipping.
Right, and I don't know if you've noticed this, but since the pandemic, and we're a couple years now, past that, many restaurants have raised their menu prices more than 20%, and tipping, of course, is still expected. And then on top of that, there's these service charges. Sometimes they call them different names, but I think you get the idea. It's an additional service charge or a credit card fee or additional fee. And some were expecting these all to kind of go away post-pandemic, but here they are, and of course they're not going away. One, where does that money go to? And two, are they permanently here to stay?
Where does the money go to? If it's called a service charge, then the business gets to keep the money and use it how it wants under federal law. Some state laws are different. In New York, for example, service charges are treated like tips. So restaurants are starting to charge administrative fees instead of service charges. But ultimately, service charges, administrative fees, all of these other add-on expenses that are being added to bills, that money goes to the business. We do know from academic research that people hate these kinds of add-on charges. They can tolerate one, but 2, 3, 4, and they feel like they're being nickeled and dimed to death, and they don't like it. Will this continue? I suppose that depends upon what consumers are upset, and they're expressing that upset verbally. When they start expressing their upset behaviorally by switching who they do business with, that's when you'll see pressure on businesses to get rid of these additional fees, tip requests, et cetera.
I want to ask you this. So let me switch gears very slightly. We go out to eat quite a bit. All of us do at one point or another, and you always scratch your head. You're at a nice restaurant. How much should you tip? You're at a fast food place. How much should you tip? You order something to go to pick up to take it back to the office. Should you tip, and how much should you tip? Because I think all three are different levels, and I say this because in the past, tipping was associated with a thank you, a polite thank you or appreciation for something the service worker has done. But now, of course, it's expected, and a lot of people scratch their heads. They're not sure even how much to tip sometimes.
Right. So many places to go with that. To begin with, tipping is only weakly related to service quality, even in restaurant settings where you would expect it to have a strong relationship. The average correlation is 0.2. That means 4% of the differences in tips left by different dining parties can be explained by their own evaluations of the service. So tipping really has never been primarily about rewarding good service. It is primarily in a tip by the tipper to buy the approval of the server and perhaps other onlookers. That's the main motivation for tipping. Should you tip? First off, let me say I'm not an etiquette expert, but even if I claim to be an etiquette expert, you shouldn't necessarily trust me. Tipping norms don't come from the top down. There's no tipping god who tells you what you should do. Ultimately, tipping norms evolve from the behavior of consumers. We know most people tip in restaurants, and servers then expect that tip, and they will look down on people who don't give it because it's so common, so frequently done. I feel obligated to tip in restaurants. I do not feel obligated to tip, and in fact, I do not tip for restaurant carryout, and most of the time for counter service. Unless I ask for some special treatment, the drink they make non-standard drink, then I'll tip. Otherwise, no. But that's my assessment.
Right. One last question. I know we've focused a lot on the U.S., but like when you travel to Europe and you talk about tipping, people typically maybe round up on the change or tip $1 or $2 or €1 or $2. And then you go to Asia, for example, in Hong Kong or Singapore, there's a general mandatory 10% service charge on any establishment you go to, and that money goes to the employees, I would assume. But it's kind of a fixed rate. It makes it kind of simple. There's no clicking on 15% or 10% or 20%. And I know it's a different culture than the U.S., but is it possible that those models are easier for consumers, and quite frankly, for those on a fixed budget, just easier to digest.
Certainly, it requires less thought on the part of consumers to pay a mandatory fee that's added to their bill. So automatic service charges are easy to understand. It's clear what you have to do. Mentally, it's a lot easier. But because it's specified as a charge, as a fee, you have to pay it. That means poorer customers or customers who are down on their luck are going to have to pay that fee in a way that they don't necessarily have to tip, right? I mean, the beauty of tipping is it's an optional payment. And those who can't afford to do so don't have to tip, or they can tip smaller amounts. That's why I said earlier, tipping's really an opportunity for wealthy and generous people to subsidize the dining behavior and service experiences of less wealthy and generous